We're back with the football podcast. We're going to be finishing up the NFC grades. We're going to be talking some ball. It's going to be fun. Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start off with some hot gossip, some big news around the NFL. There wasn't much this week, but there were a few things that caught my eye. The first one I want to talk about is Jaire Alexander going to the Ravens. Jonathan, what do you think about this move?
The rich get richer. That's what this move is. I mean, the secondary of the Ravens was already scary, and it's not as intimidating as, of course, it's been across the history of the Ravens organization. But anytime you're able to add a piece that has the talent of Jaire Alexander, there's almost no downside. And the fact that they really did not have to pay him that much at all.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like some people, I think, just are overthinking this move because they're like, oh, but the injury concern, yada, yada, yada. When in reality, it's one of those things where it's like they didn't pay that much money. And so if the downside is they just keep a very good Ravens team, but the upside is that now they have the potential to be one of the best secondary units within the league, that makes a lot of sense, especially because if you look back to our AFC North grades, when I talked about the Ravens, I talked about how last year their biggest team need was their secondary. And so the fact that they filled that with Xavier Watts and then now, no, not Xavier Watts, Malachi Starks and now Jaire Alexander, it's absolutely amazing. It's a huge move.
Yeah, there's no... It's almost impossible to see a downside to a move like this, and the fact that, and two opposite sides of the ball, but obviously I'm a huge fan of Jaire Alexander and Lamar Jackson as a Louisville fan for college football and college basketball, and just a huge fan of Louisville in general. And so there's immediate locker room chemistry. It feels like it's there. It's hard to see this, whether off the field, on the field, being a detrimental move. At worst, it has minimal impact. But this is the type of move that a team that feels like they're on the cusp of a Super Bowl run makes. This is that extra little piece here and there that you add to a roster in the hopes of pushing you over the hump. And it's not the idea that Jaire Alexander, individually, as great as he can be, is going to push you over the hump. But collectively, moves like this are what you have to do as an organization.
Exactly. And so when we look at their now starting secondary, we're talking about Marlon Humphrey, Nate Wiggins, Jaire Alexander, Kyle Hamilton, backup Chidobe Awuzie, and then, now they brought in Starks. And so here's something interesting. So last year, when it comes to the secondary, the league average passer rating allowed was 92.3. Let's look at the passer rating allowed by this secondary. Marlon Humphrey, 58.5. Nate Wiggins, 59.7, Jaire Alexander, 77.6, Kyle Hamilton, 82.9. Like, these guys are above average at all of those things. And I think the underrated part of this is just the flexibility.
And the Kyle Hamilton, oh, yes. And the Kyle Hamilton one, to be clear, if you're listening to those numbers and being like, that means Kyle Hamilton is the worst of those. That's really because Kyle Hamilton's actually being put in the toughest situations, especially in short yardage, quick passes, especially to tight ends, which means there's a much higher chance of accuracy and receptions. But what Kyle Hamilton is able to do, just as a little side note, is incredible on a football field.
Yeah, he's probably the best safety in the league, I would imagine. I think he's kind of earned that by this point. So, yeah, no, I think it's a great move.
Would agree.
It really scares me as a Bengals fan, just because I felt like last year the only real edge up we had on them was like, yeah, well, at least we can score a bunch of points. And so, like, coming into this year, if, our defense just takes somewhat of a stride, if we're able to sign Trey Hendrickson, yay, look, now we can potentially win some of those games, and this really makes it a lot more difficult.
Absolutely.
Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, again, there wasn't that much big news that I wanted to talk about, but one thing that's interesting is the Madden ratings came out for Madden 26. Now, these are beta ratings, but Jonathan, I kind of wanted to play a little game with you because they came out with team overall ratings. And so this is preseason, before the season starts, but I want you to guess the top 10 overall teams in Madden 2026. So guess the top 10 Madden 2026 teams.
Okay. Can I get a range in terms of what's the first place overall ranking and the 10th place overall ranking?
The first place is a 92 and the 10th place is, it's tied for 10th, is 86.
Wow, so that's a very small range.
Oh, you're saying it's
only
small?
92
okay,
overall.
It's pretty small.
Well, well, I just mean in terms of, I'm going to be honest, I haven't played Madden a lot in recent years, and so 92 seems relatively low for the number one overall team.
Yeah, so with Madden, the overall is a lot lower than like the player individual overall compared to like the team. So,
I mean, I have to. Let me throw the obvious ones in there.
Yeah.
Am I guessing this in order or just throwing them out
just
there?
Just throw out teams. Just guess the top teams. We'll see.
Philadelphia.
Philadelphia is number 9 at 87 overall.
9 seems low. It doesn't show. I thought that they would be top 5, but that's low. Kansas City.
Kansas City's number 1 with 92. They're tied for first.
Oh, wow. Okay. That makes me happy. I'm actually a little bit surprised by that. Detroit
is their 5th with an 88 overall. Baltimore's, I guess, 2nd/3rd at 91.
Buffalo
is just outside the top 10. They have an 85.
Wow.
Right? It's crazy.
As a certified Bills hater, that seems disrespectful.
Yeah, I would say.
Let's go. There's got to be a weird NFC team that's in there. Well, let's go Washington, the Commanders.
No, Washington is at the bottom. They're a 78 overall. Dude, these rankings are ridiculous.
The Buccaneers.
Buccaneers are just outside the top 10 with an 84 overall.
Okay. That's more so shocking relative to Washington.
They're all shocking relative to Washington.
What NFC teams are? Maybe I'll come back to the FC. Is Cincinnati in there just with Joe Burrow?
Yeah, Cincinnati is in there. They're an 87 overall. So they're 7th. They're tied with 7th with another team in the AFC North.
Pittsburgh?
Nope.
Cleveland?
Cleveland is an 87 overall.
What?
I know. It's
Cleveland
absolutely
is
ridiculous.
9 is 9 points higher than Washington.
Yep. And they're the same grade as the Eagles. They're the same overall as the Eagles.
You're joking. These are fake ratings.
They're not. These are the beta ratings.
This might be the biggest win that the Browns organization has had in decades.
Oh my gosh. It's so funny. Okay, so you have
What?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5 teams left. You have 5 teams left.
There's got to be some NFC. Random NFC and change. Green Bay.
Nope. Green Bay is outside of the top 10. They're an 81 overall. You have one more team that's an 86 overall, and then 2 88 overalls, an 89 overall, and then a team that's tied with the Chiefs at 92 overall.
Who am I missing that would be tied with the Chiefs? I feel
you got to consider this
even
like based on just the roster. So you need to look at like who has really talented rosters, even if we don't necessarily think they're going to translate.
Tied with the Chiefs at 92 on a talented roster. Who have I not said? Let's go. Okay, here's a weird question. This isn't for the 92. Is New England?
No, New England's near the bottom at 80 overall. That'd be funny though. I could see it happening.
Talented roster. Miami on the defensive side, especially. What?
Miami.
I was saying that they're.
Oh, I thought you were guessing them. Miami is an 89 overall. They're 4th.
Offensively, they're loaded, but I mean, their secondary is going to be the worst in the league.
Yeah.
Okay. 92 overall. Who am I missing? Give me a conference.
It's in the NFC West.
Oh, LA?
Nope, they're outside. They're an 82 overall.
There's no way it's the 49ers.
It's the 49ers. Dude, it's terrible. So
they
you got the top
talent.
4. Yeah, they did. That doesn't matter apparently. So you got the top 4. You're missing 5, 6, and then the team, and then 10th.
Atlanta.
So 5 and 6 are both not Atlanta. 84 overall. 5 and 6 are both in the NFC. One's in the NFC North. One's in the NFC East.
Dallas.
Dallas is 88 overall, tied for 4th. Then the other team is the NFC North.
Oh, Minnesota. Minnesota does have a talented roster.
Nope.
No, Chicago?
No, it's not. It's the only one left. Who have you not said in the NFC North?
Green Bay.
No, you.
Wait, I thought I already said Detroit. Have I not said Detroit yet?
I don't think so. Maybe that's my fault. I don't remember you saying Detroit. Okay, so now you're missing this team you're not going to get. This is the team that's kind of like tied for 10th with the Steelers. They're an 86 overall.
What's the division?
They're in the AFC East.
The Jets?
The Jets, exactly. So just going through it, the Chiefs are a 92 overall. Then is the 49ers, tied for 1st at 92 overall. The Ravens at 91 overall. The Dolphins at 89. Lions at 89. Cowboys at 88. Bengals at 87. Browns at 87. Eagles at 87. Jets at 86. Steelers at 86. What that means is that the Bills are the 3rd overall, highest overall on Madden in their division. Just to name a few problems with this. It's ridiculous.
I don't even know where to start. One, the most blatant one. What talent is on Cleveland's roster to make it? Are they counting are they saying that prime Deshaun Watson's going to be what?
I think that part of it has to do with Myles Garrett. I think he elevates their overall a lot, probably. And then I couldn't tell you. I don't really know what is driving that. Yeah, when I saw this, I thought it was fake. I'm pretty sure it's real. I'm pretty sure. Like I also looked at it and immediately started second guessing, like, if this is true, because it is outlandish.
If this is rage bait, it's top tier stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
That's an all-time list, man. Putting the Cleveland Browns tied overall in rate. No matter how you think of Philadelphia's offseason, for the Cleveland Browns to be tied with the defending Super Bowl champions is insane.
No, yeah, it's ridiculous. It is absolutely insane. But yeah, no, that's the ratings, man.
Chiefs
That's
on
it.
top. That's all that matters.
I guess so. Okay, well, we can move on. Jonathan, who's your first team in the NFC West that you want to grade?
All right, this is our Adam. This is our last episode of off-season grades, and then we
It
are
is.
looking towards the next season. So we have to
Absolutely.
savor this moment. My first, my first team, I'm taking the NFC West, and even though we'll be switching it up, I'm going in order last to first in the division, which means, shockingly, as very few people would have guessed going into last season, the San Francisco 49ers ending their season 6-11, and the floodgates of injury broke loose. There's no other way around it. In points per game, I will note they were actually slightly above average at 13th, but in terms of points allowed, they were bottom 4. And the
Wow.
McCaffrey injury kind of gets highlighted the most because he was the biggest name. But when we talk about defensive injuries last season, I almost feel like it gets overlooked because of how much Detroit's defense suffered. I mean, San Francisco they were just dropping like flies. And so it was insurmountable almost. So you, to a certain extent, have to chalk the season up to a wash. That does not mean, though, that they inherently are reloading for this last season. So as we've done in the past, the way I look at this is coaching, draft, and free agency. Starting with coaching, there's no major changes. I want to note that Kyle Shanahan, I believe, is a genuinely great coach.
Mm-hmm.
But he has now officially tied himself to Brock Purdy. You know, Kyle Shanahan didn't just get looped out of discussion about extending Brock Purdy. He was an integral part of this. Meaning, in my opinion, when you agree to pay a quarterback like an all-time franchise quarterback, you don't get to have excuses anymore. So Kyle Shanahan, when people talk about Brock Purdy, no matter what your opinion of Brock Purdy's talent is, Kyle Shanahan signed off on paying this guy buku bucks, which means that his performance is inherently tied to Purdy. And I think that's important to note. When we look at the draft, it was not a shock whatsoever that they spent their first 5 picks on defensive players, 3 of those on the defensive line. I wanted to highlight 2 of those picks. The first being their first round pick, Mykel Williams, the edge out of Georgia. And this guy could finally be the answer in terms of assisting Nick Bosa on the edge, to be able to potentially have a dual pass rush threat and potentially mean that in certain situations Bosa's not having to be double teamed. That's huge. And even though I believe he was I want to say, I don't know what pick he was, but it was outside of the top 10. Despite that, it's still potentially a steal relative to being a first round pick, because his stock dropped slightly due to a left knee injury. So relative to a top half of the first round, they got pretty good value here, in my opinion. And if he's healthy, he'll have an immediate impact. And then the second thing I wanted to point out, Nick Martin, the linebacker out of Oklahoma State, he missed 7 games last year to an MCL injury. It didn't require surgery, but it certainly hurt his draft stock. However, this is still more of a gamble than a steal, given the other linebacker talent that was still available to San Francisco. And this guy's unlikely to start immediately, but it's important to note that this guy is the vision in terms of replacing Dre Greenlaw. So overall, this draft, it's not near the top of my draft board, whatever my opinion matters for, but it was a necessary draft in terms of just dumping talent into into a defense that bled players. In terms of free agency, the highlight here is, of course, in terms of, well, not even in terms of positives necessarily, depending on what you think
Depending
of
on
the
how you
guy,
look
but
at it.
but Brock Purdy, 5 years, $265 million with $100 million guaranteed. On a personal note, incredibly happy for him. For this guy to be Mr. Irrelevant and to
Right.
receive his first non-rookie contract, to receive $100 million guaranteed, it's one of the greatest stories in NFL history, just objectively. But so I don't even want to necessarily start a whole Brock Purdy discussion. We can just leave it at that one word. But
We have a video on our social media about it.
It's in the eyes of the beholder at a certain point. Either you think this guy's worth the money or you don't think he's worth the money. And there's really no middle ground there. So fill in the blanks with your own opinion at home.
Mm-hmm.
They did also, it's important to note, extend George Kittle with what will be the last contract of his prime. It's a 4-year extension. He's 31 right now, I believe. It keeps him through 2029. So this is going to be the last contract of George Kittle's full prime. And I did not realize that George Kittle was that old. I still think of him in his 20s, but he's officially into his 30s now.
Wow.
But we've somewhat buried the lead here in terms of free agency because of the defensive losses. I'll just name them, and these are just the highlights. Javarius Ward, Hufanga, Dre Greenlaw, Leonard Floyd. They lost all of that talent, which is why when we look at last season and we talk about all the injuries that the defense had, part of the problem when you're projecting towards this season is that a lot of those guys that were injured and missed playing time last year, they don't have on their roster this year. So it's not like they're revamping health-wise and now they can go all in. They lost most of the guys anyway. They did retain and extend Fred Warner. That's kind of the one silver lining of this offseason on the defensive side. And on a personal note, Fred Warner might legitimately be my favorite defensive player to watch. Even last season, it is, if you're new to football, let me describe this to you now. It is very rare, especially not even for an edge player, for a linebacker, for you to be able to tune into a game and simply enjoy watching that game of football because of how good one player is. Mm-hmm. That's how great Fred Warner is. That personal note aside, this offseason, it's a grade C. Now, that is actually higher than a lot of people would say. A lot of people give them a D or even an F. The problem is that my criteria for grading this looks at this a little bit differently because it has to be understood what could the 49ers have done, you know? Like, it's not as if they had the ability to preserve this defense and for whatever reason chose not to. So yes, they put themselves in this position, but I can't necessarily fully knock them and say, what are they doing? That's like, we knew this was coming down the pipeline. We knew going into last season that this was going to be the last year of this defensive core with, with Purdy on a rookie contract. And now Purdy gets paid and the defensive players are gone. And so that was the reality that we knew. Now, that doesn't mean I'm giving them anything higher than a C, but that's just the reality you have to deal with.
Well, and I think that same kind of concept has kind of led me to be less critical of the Brock Purdy extension, because there is a certain I guess, something to be said for the fact that, he was the quarterback when they went to a Super Bowl. And
Yeah.
obviously, I think where the difference in how you view Brock Purdy is based on how impactful you think that defense and the tertiary weapons were to that Super Bowl run, and how reliant they were on Brock Purdy when that happened. But he is at the very least a competent enough quarterback that with the right roster, you can get to a Super Bowl. And when I look at that signing compared to the market with guys like Tua, with guys like even Dak Prescott or Trevor Lawrence, I can confidently say at least they paid a guy who has led their team to a Super Bowl. And a lot of their offense really is reliant on Christian McCaffrey and that zone run game and the play action pass. And so they have to make moves assuming Christian McCaffrey is going to play, even though at this point in his career, it really seems like a question mark every season. And so for them to say, we have this guy that like Christian McCaffrey, he's the focal point of our offense, and this is just the way that the quarterback market is right now for second contracts. This is what we have to pay him to retain him, and that's just what we're going to have to do. And so you're right. It seems like they were kind of in a bind, and all the moves they did was the best that they could to stay competent.
And it is worth noting that, and to be clear, Christian McCaffrey as a player is almost irreplaceable except for maybe Saquon Barkley. Their rushing game, and a large part of it is due to Shanahan's incredible scheming with Jordan Mason and Isaac Guerendo, actually maintained pretty well. They weren't some bottom 5 rushing offense in the NFL. In fact, their offense was above average. It was competent enough. And so to me, it's basically at this point, the 49ers are on a 2-year timeline in post this offseason. Develop these defensive players through the draft, and then hoping really realistically going into 2026 that you can bring in another crop of defensive players, and the ones you've just drafted step up. So to me, and this isn't like some record prediction video, to me, the expectation for the 49ers this season should not be that they're making a Super Bowl run this year, or even potentially, in my opinion, realistically making a run at this division.
Yeah, and we'll talk about exactly why that's the case. I think we're both high on one particular team within that division. Yes. But speaking of Christian McCaffrey, let's talk about his old team, the Carolina Panthers. So last year, the Carolina Panthers went 5-12. I feel like their whole entire season was defined by the ups and downs of Bryce Young. So Bryce Young started off really terribly, and he was benched for Andy Dalton, the Red Rifle. Let's go. But he returned in week 8. And I think it really shows a lot about his character for him to get benched, and instead of basically pouting about it, he said, yeah, I sucked. I'm going to get better. And in that last stretch, he threw for 2,100 yards, 15 touchdowns, and only 6 interceptions, with 0 interceptions in the final 3 games. And you kind of see, you kind of got to see exactly everything that you want to see from a first overall pick. And even though there are other, I think looking back, it's still safe to say that CJ Stroud on my poster just fell. I was so nervous that's going to happen. Okay, whatever. Even though we can still pretty safely say I think that CJ Stroud should have been the number 1 overall pick, Bryce Young is showing himself that he can be a franchise quarterback.
Yeah. It is worth noting that, like you were saying, it's not even that they were good. For the last 4 to 5 weeks of the season, the Panthers were a legitimately fun football team to watch, in large part due to Bryce Young. He
led 6 game-winning or game-time drives in 10 games after returning.
Yep.
It's ridiculous. So that's kind of where the Panthers were at last year offensively. Defensively, they were terrible. They sucked. In fact, they allowed the most points in NFL history for a season. And obviously it is working against them with the
I didn't know
17
that.
game season. But yeah, no, it's pretty terrible. They were last in pressure rate last year with their defensive line. They had the third fewest sacks in the league, and they ranked last against the run. So this is not this is not a team that, like, you know, one drafted free agency, you can all of a sudden be like, oh, this is like a playoff team. Like, when you have a defense that bad, it takes a few years to really get going. So looking at their team needs, primarily defense, they need an edge rusher. We talked
Really?
about yeah, believe it or not. We talked about the edge rusher and the presser rate. They need a wide receiver. One, you know, Thielen is just kind of older, and two, a lot of their wide receivers right now kind of do the same things. And last year specifically, the Panthers ranked 30th in yards per pass attempt. So they just need depth at that position. They need more weapons for Bryce Young. Cornerback is another position need. They have J.C. Horn, who's a major injury concern. And then last year, Michael Jackson, who was their other corner, struggled in pretty much every coverage metric that you can look at across the board. So, and then obviously safety. They need to replace both starters. So we'll see. But yeah, so that's kind of the major needs that they have. Obviously there's a lot more because they were just so bad, but those are the ones that I highlighted. So looking at the draft, obviously in the first draft, in the first round, at number 8 overall, they got Tet McMillan. I liked this move. I kind of feel like, you know, we can talk about Travis Hunter, but I kind of feel like he was the number 1 wide receiver within this draft. I think that he adds more dimension to the offense and is a great potentially wide receiver 1, wide receiver 1B, seeing how Xavier Legette turns out. Number 51, they picked Nick Skirton from he's an edge rusher. He was incredibly productive in college. He's just a great piece. They got another edge rusher, a safety, tight end, another wide receiver. I don't feel like, other than Tet McMillan, any of the names kind of shout out at you, but they did a great job picking character culture guys that are going to be able to kind of bring them into the future. And it seems kind of like when you have a defense like that last year, anything new is better than what you had. So
fair. No, entirely fair. Yeah.
So the fact that they focus so much on the defense, I think, and also providing weapons for Bryce Young, that kind of seems like the things that you needed to do. Looking at their free agency, they re-signed J.C. Horn, kind of a mixed bag, really great corner whenever he's healthy. He's not healthy that often. They have Michael Jackson. They brought him back. And then Trayvon Moehrig, he's really good. He's young. He's incredibly productive. So I think that he's going to be good. He's a safety. And then as far as the edge rushers, they brought in Pat Jones Jr. the second. Last year was kind of his breakout year, had 9 tackles for a loss, 7 sacks, 12 QB hits. So obviously, again, those aren't numbers that are like that put you in with the elite company of edge rushers within the NFL, but that's production that Carolina could have used last year. And so overall, I gave their offseason a B. I felt like, we talk about this a lot when we're grading off seasons, but you have to think of it relative to what they can do and what their expectations are. Carolina is not going to be this hot to trot destination where all of these superstars are going to want to sign with. And so they kind of have to sign or grow through the draft. They have to grow through the, I guess, building around the edges. And so again, and we've talked about this a lot when it comes to these rookie quarterbacks that were drafted high overall, that it's kind of seems like the off seasons, at least when we look at them in the future, are going to be graded based on the production of that quarterback. And so right now, it's easy to look on the bright side. this could be a catastrophic failure depending on how Bryce Young does. But I think that they at least made competent enough decisions that were above average. And I think they're going to be better next year. And they put Bryce Young in a decent situation. And so for that reason, I think it's a B.
Yeah, like you were saying, I think the ideal move outside of the draft for a franchise in this position is a pickup like Patrick Jones, someone
Yeah.
who has a breakout season, but the team that he's previously with, Minnesota, isn't fully willing to commit to him, and so the Panthers have to pick at the scraps. But when you're doing that, you can absolutely find guys that produce. And so those are the types of pickups that a team in this position needs. And like you said, you're literally approaching this for the position where you're like, well, it can't possibly be worse than last season.
Exactly.
Those are the types of moves that an organization like Carolina has to make right now. So a
like,
B seems appropriate.
This is the type of team that if they could have more than 53 guys on their roster, they should just bring in anybody that has any potential to rush the quarterback effectively. Like, let's just throw bodies on the field and see what sticks.
Yeah.
They just need new guys in the room.
Yeah. And the Panthers will be a must-watch team next season because Bryce Young legitimately showed moxie and talent and shades of why he was a number one overall quarterback, especially in those last 5 weeks of the season. And
it's all because of the leadership of Andy Dalton.
The Red Rifle.
The Red Rifle.
Well, speaking of interesting quarterback situations, the Arizona Cardinals, 8-9 last season, and it's kind of, this team is one of those. I know we had the interesting statistic about the Miami Dolphins last season. This is also one of those teams that was almost perfectly mediocre. They were 12th overall in offense, 15th overall in defense. Although weirdly, the defense was actually a lot better than I anticipated going into last season, and the offense was slightly disappointing. This is where I want to have a quick little, mini segment. Is Kyler Murray good? I don't know. I mean, when you look at his Pro Football Reference page, he's played 6 seasons. Obviously, some of those have been hampered by injuries. But even in his 3 fully healthy seasons, I believe you said 3 fully healthy, he's never cracked 4,000 passing yards. And his career high in passing touchdowns, give me a guess. What do you think his career high in passing touchdowns is?
27?
What? 26.
Really?
Yes.
Let's go.
Yeah. Good guess.
It can't be that good, but it's Kyler Murray, so it has to be decent.
Now, it is worth noting in that he's hit that 26 mark twice. In his sophomore season when he did it, which was probably his best season, he did add on top of that. He was just under 4,000 passing yards and 26 touchdowns. He did tack on over 800 rushing yards and 11 rushing touchdowns. He's one of those quarterbacks that's, at this point, very definitively, with all the information we have, not top 10.
Okay.
But I'm also not willing to call him bottom 10 or even necessarily bottom 12 to 15. What do you do with a Kyler Murray? Because when we talk about these quarterbacks that get paid, and it feels like Kyler Murray always slips out of the discussion. It's always like the Trevor Lawrence and the Tua situation. We kind of forget that Kyler Murray got paid like a franchise quarterback.
Yeah, I think that part of the reason why we forget that is just because I think part of it has to just do with, if you think about like the Jaguars and the Dolphins, like they've seen recent success. And so there's pressure that comes with that as a quarterback. Another reason why I think that might be the case in terms of, I guess, like storyline is just because Kyler Murray has been injured so often, so he's just kind of been out of the limelight a little bit. But I think when you're looking at Kyler Murray, I'm pretty high on him in terms of how I think long term his career is going to turn out. Like
That's what I think somewhat.
I don't necessarily I'm not talking about Super Bowls here, but I'm just talking about production. Like I think he's going to be a very productive quarterback for a decently long amount of time. In terms of quarterback rankings right now, I do feel as if that he might be in that like 10 to 15 range. I think that because when I think about quarterback rankings, I think of it less as quarterback rankings and more of tiers where you can kind of reasonably put people within, or you can rank people according to what you prefer, but there are clearly tiers of quarterbacks. So the upper tier is Mahomes, Allen, Burrow, Jackson. And then that second tier is like Stafford, Hurts, Herbert. And then below that would be guys like, and actually maybe Prescott would be in that upper tier. And then you have those guys. Yeah. And then you have guys who are, I guess you could say like good, productive, but not necessarily like, you know, the highlight of the offense. So talking about guys like Brock Purdy and Jared Goff, a guy who was kind of in that discussion was like Kirk Cousins. Those kind of guys where you're not really saying like this is the staple of their offense, but they're not full force multipliers, but they are good enough to sustain a competent offense with great weapons. And then outside of that, you have guys who have just like ups and downs where you see the potential for that, but then you also see the problems. I kind of view Kyler Murray within that range. And I think that when it comes to his ability, like when it comes to his ceiling, that's kind of where I'm ranking him, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think that when it comes to that, like there are a lot of guys within that specific tier. And so I kind of rank him. And I think that tier kind of falls in within like 8, 9, 10, 11 to like 15, 16 before you get into guys that are just below average. And so from that perspective, I think he's higher up in that tier. I would rate him around 12th probably. I'd have to list it all out, but around that range.
Yeah. I'll move on after this, but I think I agree with 90% of what you just said. And yet on the other side of things, he could be out of Arizona after this season.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the flip side to this discussion, which is why it's so interesting. But looking at their actual offseason, a note on the coaching, Jonathan Gannon, he's heading into his third year with Arizona, and there was objectively immense improvement from 23 to 24. Does the roster have the capability to make that one last push to go from, say, a 8-9 to a 10-7 and slip into a wild card spot? That's the question this year. Mm-hmm. But it's undeniable that Jonathan Gannon has almost been underrated in terms of the success that he has brought to the Cardinals relative to the state of the team when he entered. When we look at the draft, Walter Nolan, defensive tackle from Ole Miss, this is sort of the final piece of this 3-year overhaul of the defensive line. There isn't an automatic pressure for him to start day one, but he absolutely could. And they both have veteran talent on that defensive line and have brought in veteran talent. So look to him to be one of those names, even for a first rounder, that flies under the radar for the first half of the season. And by the time you look up, he's highly unlikely that he would win Defensive Rookie of the Year. Wouldn't be shocked to see his name on the ballot or be top 5 in that. And then the steal of the draft, in my opinion, Will Johnson, cornerback out of Michigan. Johnson had, for almost the entirety of the latter end of his college career, top 10 pick aspirations. But then knee injury concerns absolutely tanked his value. If he is healthy, this is your long-term CB1. This is the guy who, again, if healthy, you just throw at the other team's best weapon and say, shut it down. That's the upside of Will Johnson. And so those are the two highlight picks of this draft for me. But even beyond that, this was a quality draft from Arizona. When we look towards free agency, relatively quiet, but not necessarily in a bad way. They snag Josh Sweat from the Eagles and Calais Campbell from the Dolphins. Those were probably their two biggest acquisitions. Not some, thing that you're throwing on to social media and making a big fuss about, but it's quality player acquisitions, plenty of quality extensions. And then one thing of note, if you look at a list on a spreadsheet, say, of their free agency in terms of financial commitments. So of all the players that they gained or lost in free agency and how much money they're being paid, their first loss is Roy Lopez to the Lions, who was making $3.5 million. So they did not lose anyone that the NFL values higher than $3.5 million per year. When you look at something like that, there's no huge acquisitions, which is why I can't give this an A+, but I give this an A offseason. And here's the thing. That's not me projecting an A season, as we've discussed. It just means that they drafted well, and in free agency, they maintained all of the talent that they wanted to and added a little bit of talent on top of the roster. For a team in the position of Arizona Cardinals, that is an A.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like there's not really anything to add there. Like, yep, they kind of did what they were supposed to do, and that's really cool for them. I really like Will Johnson. I think that he's going to be amazing. I think if he can stay healthy, he has the upside of being one of the best corner in the NFL. So, yeah, that's awesome.
Absolutely.
Okay, talking about the Saints. So I just laugh when I think about the season because I'm just like remembering watching that Saints Cowboys games and like being like, whoa, the Saints are back. Derek Carr is the GOAT.
You said you laughed when you think about the Saints season. I just laugh when I think about the Saints. Just as a concept.
Feel bad for Saints fans, man. So they went 5-12 last year. They started really strong. They destroyed the Panthers and the Cowboys, and everyone was like, ooh, is this a big deal? I remember talking to my brother-in-law because didn't the Chiefs play the Saints pretty early last season?
Yeah, it was on Monday Night Football, and the Chiefs were simultaneously playing the Saints while the Royals were playing the Yankees in the MLB playoffs. It was a good night.
Yeah. So I was talking to my brother-in-law who's a Chiefs fan, and he was talking to me about it. And, he was talking about how like, ooh, like, do you think the Saints could give us trouble? And I was like, I don't know, because if you think about it, last year going into the season, it was one of those situations where it's like the Cowboys are really good and they just destroyed the Cowboys. And looking back, we can say like, no, the Cowboys, that was who the Cowboys were pretty bad. And they just kind of got hot at the right time. The Saints are not actually that good. But it's just funny to look at what the perception was and how like there was this wave from the media of people talking about like, look at the Saints. Well, they ended 5-12. I think they lost 7 games after that. So it was clearly just hype. Last year they lost Derek Carr midseason. He was injured midseason, and then he ultimately retired because of it. Weirdly enough, kind of a W for the Saints.
Yes, very much so.
From a cap space perspective, because, and we've joked about this before, but the Saints like really hysterically have like one of, if not the worst cap space situation in the NFL.
And their fans
basically,
and their local media live in denial about it. They truly believe that
yeah,
there was always going to be some magical way out of it, and it was just pure fantasy land that they were living in. I don't want to trash Saints fans too much
right.
because of the misery they've lived through. They lived in denial about that cap space situation.
Exactly. And so really, really bad. And it's because they never ever hit the reset button. And so basically they kept pushing off just like an accounting perspective. They kept pushing off when they were going to pay these players and when it was going to affect the cap until it's like, oh crap, in a few years, like technically they have negative like 50 million cap space. And so basically what it takes to fix that is a complete reset and losing and not making huge contracts towards certain players. And so the fact that they no longer have to pay Derek Carr, I believe it was like a $30 million contract, is actually huge for them, and it kind of sets them up for a rebuild. And that's kind of where they're at. They hired a new head coach. They hired Kellen Moore, which I don't even really want to get into that discussion because he just kind of seems like, and like maybe this is going to come back to haunt me, but he really just seems like in a class or in a coaching cycle that included Liam Cohen and Ben Johnson, just like the leftovers. I think that
Fair.
he's a great offensive coordinator. I think that when you compare him to those two other guys, I just see a lot more upside in terms of head coaching, if that makes sense. Like this is not anything against Kellen Moore's scheme, but more about, I guess you could say just more about like, how much do I believe in him to be a leader within a Saints organization? And the thing is it's hard too, because he's then going into a situation where like, it's not a good established culture. And so for me, like, I think that I don't necessarily think the Saints made a bad move because they clearly needed a new head coach. They fired their previous head coach like in the middle of the season, but I don't know. We'll see. They brought in new coordinators. The offensive coordinator, he was an internal hire. I think he's going to be good. Again, it's one of those situations where the offensive coordinators somewhat get overlooked when you have an offensive-minded head coach. But I think that his name is Doug Nessmeyer. I think he's going to be great. And then in terms of their defensive coordinator, they brought in Brandon Staley, which if you've been watching us, you know how I feel about Brandon Staley. But, you know, when it comes to him as a defensive coordinator, I think it's fine. It's really just about him as an offensive coordinator. That being said, one of the reasons why I liked the Ben Johnson coaching decision is because they brought in as their DC, Brad Allen. That's his name, right?
Allen.
I'm like, Dennis Allen. Right. Dennis Allen, who was the previous head coach of the Saints. And even though obviously that didn't work out, I think that Dennis Allen was really kind of in a really he was just in a crappy situation when it comes to the Saints, just because of the cap space situation, the roster situation, everything related to that. And so I kind of view them bringing him in as a benefit to Ben Johnson in terms of head coach experience. I don't view Brandon Staley in that same kind of way. But when it comes to their biggest needs, they could add some wide receiver depth. Obviously, they have two guys, Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed, who are great pieces. There's a question mark related to Chris Olave just with his health. Although, you know, the classic meme is that Derek Carr just keeps throwing him into these concussions. And so we'll see if that actually makes a difference.
Suicide balls.
Exactly. The second need would be like the defensive line. They were seventh worst in the NFL overall. They allowed 2,400 rushing yards, which was the second most. They gave up 6,400 yards total, which was the third most. They were just ineffective. And then the offensive line, it really did struggle. They were ranked 24th within the NFL. So they need new enforcements to support their new quarterback, which we'll get to in the draft. I'm going to let Jonathan, I think, kind of lead that conversation. And so looking at free agency signings, they brought in Justin Reed, which I thought was a good pickup. They re-signed Chase Young, and they brought in Dante Pettis, he's a decent wide receiver. It was just a 1-year deal. Obviously, again, they're kind of handicapped by their cap situation. So let's just jump straight into the draft. Round 1, they got a left tackle from Texas, Kelvin Banks. He allowed the lowest pressure rate of any Power 4 left tackle over the past 2 seasons. I love this pick. I think that he's going to be, depending, I think he could be the next franchise legend for the Saints. I think that he has the potential to be one of, if not one of the best or the best left tackle within the league for years to come. I legitimately, when I watch the film on this guy, that's kind of the ceiling that I see with him. Round 2, who'd they pick, Jonathan?
Tyler Shaw, quarterback out of the University of Louisville.
How do we feel about this, Jonathan?
Tyler Shaw is the truth.
Okay.
No, I will approach this realistically. I'll try to put as much of my bias aside as a Louisville fan, and Tyler Shaw gave Louisville one of potentially its best season post Lamar Jackson, depending on how you look at it. This is an NFL ready quarterback, and part of that is because of the age, which is a turnoff for a lot of people. When you spend a pick in the second round on a quarterback, I feel like people don't know how to discuss it, because when a quarterback gets taken in the second round, it just throws off the general public's discussion of how we should view a quarterback.
Yeah.
I think that this is someone who provides legitimate value to the Saints organization, is capable of winning games. He's just objectively an intelligent dude who loves football. He's going to be able to pick up the offensive scheme and system that's being implemented. The question is simply, at the NFL level, is he able to perform? And so when you're talking about Tyler Shaw, barring some ridiculously high ceiling projections that you would want to discuss, what you're looking for here is exactly what you're getting. And and that means it's somewhat up to your perspective and the eye of the beholder. You could either see that as a bad thing. It's like, I probably know exactly what I'm getting with Tyler Shaw. The problem is I think I know what the Saints are going to get out of Tyler Shaw, and it's going to be better than the entirety of the post Drew Brees era. I'll say this right now. I'll stake my claim. Tyler Shaw is going to be considered and looked back on more fondly than Derek Carr is in New Orleans. I feel confident in saying that.
Yeah, I agree with basically all of your major points. I think that this pick was scrutinized more because of the whole Shedeur Sanders situation. And if you would have taken that out of this, then this wouldn't really be a pick that was talked about as much as it did. And I think that's kind of true with even the Dylan Gabriel situation. I would say, I feel like most teams kind of view second round, third round quarterbacks, specifically more in the third round, but at least second round quarterbacks, as more of potentially high ceiling picks who are most likely just going to end up as backups. Right.
Yeah.
And they're willing to take that risk. And so I think people kind of overhype this pick in terms of, or I guess they over scrutinize this pick. Cause like you said, I do think that Tyler is going to give you like exactly what you would expect. Like I think that his production is very predictable compared to most rookie quarterbacks, and that's kind of the plus when it comes to his age. Obviously, there are
Yeah.
cons related to his age. I think the negative side of this is that kind of what I talked about before with the cap space situation, how the Saints just kind of refuse to fully buy into a rebuild, and they have this concept of like building from the middle and hoping that eventually we can accumulate enough pieces that it pushes us over the edge. The thing is, and the problem with this is that as the NFL kind of goes through its ebbs and changes, and we've talked about the running back resurgence in recent years, but this really is a quarterback dominated league. You can kind of look at, just the recent Super Bowl champions and understand the type of quarterback that it takes to get there and the type of quarterback that it takes to ultimately win the Super Bowl. And so, do I think that Tyler has that ceiling? I don't think so. But in terms of, and so that's why it's like, I think for a lot of people, and specifically Saints fans, they're saying to the Saints, like, we want a franchise quarterback. The Saints don't really define the word franchise quarterback like everyone else does. I think that the Saints, when they think of a franchise quarterback, think of Derek Carr, like a competent, guy who can, in the right situation, elevate a team to a Super Bowl. And to clarify what I said before, I didn't mean that I don't think Tyler will ever make it to a Super Bowl. Like, I don't think that in the right circumstance that could never happen. I just think that he's never going to be like the primary driver of an offense. Like, I think that it's going to be kind of like a Brock Purdy situation when he went to the Super Bowl. And so I think that all of the pluses are related to Tyler as a prospect, and all the negatives are related to the Saints' general philosophy about what it takes to win a Super Bowl within the NFL.
I'll say this right. Well, first of all, before we start talking Super Bowls with the Saints, why don't we start by talking about making playoffs? But I'll say this as a fact right now, and maybe people might disagree with this. I don't even think it's that much up for debate. Tyler Shugh's floor is significantly higher than Shedeur Sanders' floor. And that's
100%.
That's I don't even see how you could dispute that if you're looking at it honestly, which is why, and again, it almost gets into the deeps. And I think some Saints fans are starting to come out, who were initially really hating on it, are coming out of that psychosis a bit. But Saints fans were almost the biggest victims of the Shedeur Sanders first round propaganda, because all of a sudden when you pass up on it and then you draft Tyler Shught, and not to make it some whole big thing, but I think it is worth noting that the element of Tyler Shught being like a white guy, it adds a layer to it as well for the Saints. And so I think that when you add all of that context together with Shedeur and Tyler Shught relatively coming onto the scene very late, he was always underrated and more, you kind of had to pour into it to see what scouts thought of Tyler Shught, but this was always in the cards, and in my opinion, it was objectively more likely going into the draft that Tyler Shught would be drafted before Shedeur Sanders. I was pretty confident about that.
Yeah. I love the word you used, propaganda, because that's exactly what it was. And then watching that draft, I just remember thinking it was so funny because obviously you had guys like Mel Kippner and just really the whole media talking about, Shedeur Sanders, he could potentially go number one. He's the best quarterback prospect in this draft, yada, yada, yada. And then obviously he fell. So there was clearly a divide between where the media ranked Shedeur Sanders compared to how NFL teams ranked Shedeur Sanders. And instead of the media being like, well, maybe we were wrong, they immediately started throwing personal attacks at Shedeur Sanders and said like, oh, well, he must just suck as a person. I can remember there were like people who, or like former players or just media members who'd be like, Shedeur, if you're watching this, you need to think long and hard about, you know, just like who you are and how you present yourself, yada, yada, yada. And it's like, maybe we shouldn't assume that Shedeur Sanders is just not a good person. And maybe we should just assume that he's not as good as a quarterback as you guys were force feeding us for, you know, the 5-month period.
That's a really
before
good
the draft.
point. Yeah, that was a really fun like the people. I mean, you put it really well, but the people who are like, this guy, first round talent, and then as soon as he drops as far as he does, man, the guy just must absolutely suck. He must just be a terrible person.
It was ridiculous. I just remember watching and just being like I don't think they even realize how insensitive and offensive what they just said was.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to the Saints. They picked up some other good pieces within the draft. They kind of addressed some needs. They picked up Vernon Brogdon from a interior defensive lineman from Texas. They brought in Jonas Sanker, safety from Virginia. Overall, I thought they had a fine draft. Brought in Quincy Riley, cornerback from Louisville. I think overall,
who is a stud? He's great.
He is. I think overall they I give their offseason like a C+. The plus is because of like how their cap space situation is so much better without Derek Carr. Yep. But then it's a C because that wasn't their decision. And so it's like, I think that if you remove the cap space situation, it is firmly a B. You add in that context, it becomes like a C or a D. But then now they're kind of actually in a situation where it's a lot easier to fix. So it's a C+. That's kind of how I view it.
Yeah, no, I think you put that well. I don't really have much to add.
Cool.
Let's talk about a team that was somewhat under discussed last year. It's the Seattle Seahawks. They went 10-7 and they just missed the playoffs and winning the division, in fact, because they were tied 10-7 with the Los Angeles Rams. And do you remember what tiebreaker was used to mean that the Rams won the division, the 4th seed, and the Seattle Seahawks didn't even make the playoffs?
I'm trying to remember how far deep was it?
The 5th. The 5th tiebreaker.
It was holy crap. Was it like AFC wins?
Strength of victory. Yep.
Oh my gosh.
Yep. The 5th overall tiebreaker to differentiate between being a 4 seed and missing the playoffs. Strength of victory. So this is one of those weird seasons for the Seahawks where they outperformed both preseason expectations and in terms of their season-long statistics of points allowed and points per game, actually overperformed as well. If you look at their points per game and points allowed, they should have been really like 8 and 9. Instead, they were 10 and 7. But also, to miss out on the playoffs and a division title because of a 5th-ranked tiebreaker is a little bit sad if you're a Seahawks fan. So it's kind of one of those bittersweet seasons.
It's pretty sad.
Yes, but I'm just saying it's similar to the Broncos season, except the Broncos actually made the playoffs, in which it's kind of one of those, wow, we had an incredible season, and then you just get shellacked in the wild card. Yeah. This is even worse than that, just because you barely miss, like you don't even get a playoff game. But it's one of those things where when you take a step back, look at it from a 5,000-foot view, you feel a lot better about this season. So when we look at coaching, And as I like to say, you'll have to take my word for this that I said it. And I think I've even discussed this with Adam in the past.
You
When
have.
they hired Mike McDonald, my prediction was that his ceiling is a defensive Sean McVay.
Yeah.
I think that Mike McDonald is just has the potential to be one of the best coaches in the NFL. And I stand by that looking at last season. And now we'll get to it. In my opinion, the talent of the roster, it might have just about stayed the same in terms of balance between gains and losses, but we'll get into that. In the draft, Gray Zabel, guard out of North Dakota State. Seattle's O-line was bottom 5 in the league, maybe even bottom 3, no matter what way you slice it. And the interior was a huge part of that. You immediately throw in a top-level starter who's going to fill a massive hole, perhaps the biggest hole that they had. So there's no other way to, I'm not guaranteeing that Gray Zabel is going to work out, but this is a pick that you have to make. So there's no other way to look at it other than positive. And then another highlight, Nick Imanwuri, safety out of South Carolina. Mike McDonald gets his Kyle Hamilton. Kyle Hamilton, who he previously coached as the defensive coordinator of the Ravens. With a guy like McDonald, I have nearly unlimited faith that he can develop someone like Imanwuri, especially given the raw talent that he possesses. Early on, he's going to be a rotational safety and not necessarily an every down player, but this is one of those players that Mike McDonald, his hands are all over this, and he's drafting this with the long-term vision of shaping this guy into a disruptive force in the secondary. So I loved this draft from Seattle, if I'm being honest. And then free agency. Geno Smith and DK Metcalf out, Sam Darnold and Cooper Kupp in. That's kind of the highlight here, is basically you lose your quarterback and your wide receiver 1 and you replace them with a new quarterback and a new wide receiver 1.
Don't forget about Tyler Lockett.
Well, Tyler Lockett. I'm talking about in terms of losses and additions. But yeah, Tyler Lockett will be there. Just as a little side note. Sorry, I apologize. Yeah, Tyler Lockett having left now. Geno Smith is 35 years old. That's just a side note. They lost him. This just seems wrong to me. That's almost sad.
It's because he broke out so late in his career.
I know, but even still, I remember watching him at West Virginia. It's shocking to me that he's 35. But that being said, with that swap, Geno and DK for Darnold and Kupp, it is objectively, in my opinion, a talent downgrade at both positions. However, I have somewhat come around to these moves. Specifically looking at it through the financial lens, at the very least, in what is a almost stopgap roster moves for Seattle, because Geno and DK and their 2 contracts that they received were given a combined basically $120 million guaranteed. Sam Darnold and Cooper Kupp, a combined $55 million guaranteed. So in terms of the financial commitment that you're moving away from, and obviously it's not one-to-one because they're getting different contracts because they're going to different teams, but you understand my point. It is a talent downgrade more likely than not, but it's also a major financial upgrade. And they also snagged DeMarcus Lawrence from the Cowboys. Long story short, you could go dive even deeper into Seattle's free agency. I wasn't personally that big of a fan of it, even though I've somewhat softened up to it. But then I also loved their draft a lot, and I really like Mike McDonald heading into year 2. I give it a flat B.
Yeah. And
I think it perfectly evens out between the draft and the free agency.
right. Well, and I think that kind of going back to the kind of the lateral moves that they made, the downgrade in talent, if you were, I guess you could say, like, to quantify that downgrade, the amount of talent that they lost would be like a lot less than the amount of money that they lost. Meaning, like,
Yes.
how, like, the difference between DK Metcalf and Geno Smith and Sam Darnold and Cooper Kupp is more than made up for by the financial situation, and the amount of money that those two players were specifically looking for. In terms of Seattle and their direction, I've kind of come around on that end a little bit. There's still a part of me that kind of wishes they would have just spent just one season kind of clearing the books and letting that defense, I guess you could say, just develop more, and, you know, getting like one more first overall pick. Like, I think that, or not first overall, just first round, higher end first round pick. I think that the Seahawks, because of their head coach, have this potential to, you know, start being just like consistent contenders. And so from that perspective, I think that it's going to take, I think in most situations, it takes kind of a down year to kind of come back from that with more assets, with flexibility. And then next year they can start making some really, you know, impactful free agency moves. They can, you know, draft their quarterback or whatever that looks like. That's kind of where I'm like, it's not what they did was bad, but I think there was an alternative that could have been better, but also is more risky. And so, because like we made a video about the Sam Darnold contract, and I think both of us were a lot lower on it than we are now. But like the context there,
and it is
that
worth
both
noting.
of us had this perception before they signed Cooper Kupp, which was that they are going to tank and do a little mini rebuild for one season to really set up McDonald for the future. And then they brought in Cooper Kupp, and it was like, okay, so that's clearly not what they were even going for in the first place. So that changes that. But
what I would say is I still think relative to the amount of money that they paid the two of them, like I said, they're clearly not looking to tank. And I don't think that they should have been looking to tank in a vacuum. Yeah. It's just what I was anticipating after moving on from Geno.
Yes.
I would call this a reloading season. It's still a reload. And I also, just as one last note, even though I don't personally agree with it, I do have to just say we are potentially even unfairly ruling out the idea. And I don't think Seattle's all in on this idea too. It's more so, hey, if it happens, awesome. Sam Darnold could have revived his career in Minnesota, and we're looking to look back 3 years from now and go, why did Minnesota let him go? Now, people are going to have forgotten the context of how terrible those last 2 games of his in Minnesota were, but there is a world in which that is long forgotten to history, and we're going, Sam Darnold had a revival in Minnesota, then they immediately move off of him, and Seattle snags him, and now they have their quarterback for the next 5 years. That is on the table.
Yeah, it's a possibility. I just don't think it's likely.
Yeah.
I think that
yes.
There are just too many, like, when you look at it, and this is what I think was like why it was why it was a surprise, but why it almost shouldn't have been. And we talked about this even last week, dude. The Vikings are a perfect situation for any quarterback. Like, if you want to talk about weapons, if you want to talk about culture, if you want to talk about defense, if you want to talk about coaching, like, they literally check all the boxes. And so it's not surprising that when you're Sam Darnold, who goes from the Jets to the Panthers to the 49ers as a backup, and even with the 49ers, when he did play as a backup, he played well, and then go to this situation, and all of a sudden he's, reviving his career, that makes sense. That doesn't mean, though, that I think that what he did last year is necessarily going to be the, like what Sam Darnold is for the rest of his career. Like, I think he's probably somewhere firmly in the middle. We've talked about how growth isn't linear within the NFL. And so from that perspective,
Yep.
that's where it's like, okay, sure. And like maybe this is a stopgap quarterback, but the problem is I do think he's going to be good enough to elevate them. So like, that's kind of where I'm like from a team building perspective, it really is just a hard conversation. Because how competent is Sam Darnold going to be? Even if you get that high end, maybe you're a playoff team, but you're probably a first round exit. Like, even if they are a playoff team. So then it's like, what does that get you in the long run?
Yeah, fair.
And that's kind of where it's like why kind of like a mini 1 year rebuild made a lot of sense to me. Okay, but we can move on to the Falcons. So last year, the Falcons season had a lot of ups and downs. It started with, I guess, if you asked most people, a down, which was in the draft when, after signing, I think one of, if not the biggest offseason contracts and signing on Kirk Cousins, they drafted at 8 overall Michael Penix. And the reason why there was so much negativity related to that pick is not just because the context of Kirk Cousins, but also because that was almost they kind of reached for him, even in terms of like the general perspective. Now, I'm going to steal your line. You'll have to believe me. I actually didn't think that was that bad of a move. You're looking at a team who, since Matt Ryan, has just not been able to find their quarterback. And I feel like, Michael, a lot of mature teams take this idea or take the concept of, we're going to draft a guy before he's ready, and then we're going to give him 2 years to develop and under a really competent, good quarterback, and then he'll be able to start and he'll be NFL ready. So that whole concept makes a lot of sense to me. I think that most teams should start doing that. Of course, what happened,
and
with
then
that,
the timeline got destroyed.
It got destroyed because Kirk Cousins was just not the same after that Achilles injury and just really kind of crapped the bed. And so this offseason really is going to be defined by Michael Penix, and that's just the way it is. But looking at their biggest needs, the biggest, most glaring one is their pass rush, right? The Falcons last year were 31st in terms of sacks and 31st in pass rush win rate in 2024. And this is a position group that they've been trying to solidify for the past few years, and they just have not been able to get it done. I think it was last year when they picked up Matthew Judon, and that was kind of their big solution to that. Was it last year or the year? I think it was last year. And
that was last year.
He just did not play to hit the standard that he set within the Patriots. Some other, needs in terms of just like depth include the linebacker position. Secondary, they have AJ Terrell, but just kind of more guys to solidify that room. They have Jesse Bates, but I think there's more that can be done. And then offensive tackle specifically, their interior line was okay. Of course, part of that was because of their center, who went to the Vikings, but we'll see. Let's just move on to the draft class. So first, and we kind of see a little bit of another unique situation when it comes to the Falcons draft here. Last year, they almost overinvested in quarterback, which I thought was a good move. This year, they did something also pretty interesting. So in the first round, pick number 15, they picked up Jalen Walker out of Georgia. He's an incredible athlete. He played and switched between off-ball linebacker as well as edge, but I think that he will translate more as an edge within the NFL, and that's kind of why they picked him up. Last year, he had an 83.0 PFF pass rush grade. So, obviously, he's a great pass rusher. When you look at his scouting profile, he is one of those guys that teams want just from a culture leadership building perspective. He has all of those chops coming into the draft, and that actually really elevated where he would be picked eventually. But in terms of raw talent, and there was a group of guys or edge rushers within this last draft class that it's like all of these guys could be picked within the first round. He was kind of middle of the pack when it comes to production. I really like this pick. I think it makes a lot of sense. He was kind of chalked in to go to the Panthers at pick 8 in a lot of people's mock drafts. And then when he fell, I think that the Falcons were like, oh, like this guy's kind of falling. Let's just pick him up. And that then led to the subsequent decision to trade back into the first round at pick number 26 to get James Pierce Jr. out of Tennessee. So this is a guy, when you talk about production, kind of the leader of the pack when it comes to those first round like potential edge rushers. On the other hand, it's the off the field issues that led him to drop so much. He's an incredible
and also
pass
how
rusher.
much Atlanta, I don't remember the specific details off the top of my head, but they gave up a first round pick next year to be able to move back into.
Yeah, speaking of which, I think that's a little bit overblown, because if you think about it this year, it's like, oh no, like they're missing their first round pick, but they basically are picking twice in the first round. And so for their front office is basically hoping that next year they are good enough that their pick will be greater than 26th. From that perspective.
Yeah, or even around this. And it's also one of those things too, where it's, there's a known commodity to having a player compared to a pick. And so if you are in love, well, clearly they were in love with the player, and then because of the talent that was suddenly, had a mini slide in the first round, you almost are just forced to take it. But it's like, hey, we still love this player. We have a chance to get him if we trade up. So I'm not saying I fully agree with it, but people act like it was some insane move. It was a cohesive, like you could see the thought process playing out in front of you.
Absolutely. I feel like this is, I don't know. Like, I think that as a whole, it makes more sense than it doesn't. I think the weird part about it is just the fact that they doubled up on positions. Like, they got 2 first-round edge rushers, but also it was like, it's been their biggest need for like 4 years now. So it's like, okay, like, at that point, it kind of makes sense. But yeah, people were kind of talking about it, like how the Browns took 2 quarterbacks, and it's like, it's not that crazy. They also got a huge pickup, Xavier Watts. Him and Ben Johnson were the 2 guys in the secondary that I was looking for the Bengals to take. He's an incredible, in terms of like his athletic prowess, he doesn't necessarily stand out. Obviously, he's an NFL athlete, but he doesn't necessarily stand out compared to the competition. But he just always seems to be where the ball is. Yeah.
The guys
over the past 2 years,
just a lazy bum.
He's a total couch potato, dude. He's just oh my gosh. But last year, or in the last 2 seasons, he's had 13 interceptions, which is 4 more than any other defender. And so incredible player. And it really does. Yes, exactly. And it really does shore up a big need within that defense. They also picked up Billy Bowman Jr. from Oklahoma. Really, really versatile.
What a name.
I know, right? Billy Bowman Jr. Versatile DB. He can play nickel or safety. So overall, really, really good
That
draft.
is a deep South Methodist
I think it was really
pastor
good. I think that they clearly... Yeah, that does kind of sound what it. That is kind of what it sounds like. Looking into their offseason pickups, they signed Leonard Floyd, a defensive end, to a 1-year, $10 million deal. Really, really great pickup, right? Awesome. He's kind of underrated. His downside is that he's 33, but yeah, no, he's really great. He's had 8.5 sacks in each of the last 5 seasons. So really, really solid pickup. And then Morgan Fox. He's pretty good. He's definitely underrated in terms of his pass rush within the interior line. Over the last 3 seasons, he's had 15.5 sacks, and he has a great pass rush win rate. So overall, I think that they clearly address their biggest need. I give them a B. The reason I gave them a B is because I don't think they did enough specifically with the offensive line. And I think that they are still a little bit. It's hard because obviously they have a lot of good weapons, right? When it comes to their offense.
So we say.
But I just feel like we haven't really seen it yet. And, maybe that could be just because of the quarterback situation. I think Bijan Robinson is obviously awesome. Kyle Pitts is a really mixed bag. I feel like I get sucked into believing that he's good every year.
What are we on
in my fantasy team.
Feels like we're on our 7th year of Kyle Pitts breakout year.
Could he be the GOAT? Yeah. So I always fall for the lies. I picked him for the past 4 years in a row. I picked him on my fantasy team and it just never worked out. I consistently believed in this man.
At a certain point, that's like Stockholm syndrome. You're a victim of abuse that keeps on crawling back.
Yeah, exactly. I just can remember convincing myself every year, this is the guy, I think. This is the time. But yeah, no, it never works out. And but back to my point, they have the weapons, Drake London, Darnell Mooney, Bijan Robinson. But I just feel like they're missing one piece specifically in terms of the short, in route dig slants, just someone to take the pressure off of Michael Penix. I think that that's something that they kind of needed. So that's kind of where it's I didn't give them an A, but they still had a really good offseason.
Yeah, an above average offseason.
For sure.
Well, let me go ahead and wrap up the NFC West with your 2024 NFC West champion Los Angeles Rams. Like I already said when talking about the Seahawks, they went 10-7 and they won the division based on the 5th overall tiebreaker, strength of victory. And this is maybe not a lot of people care about this, but it is something that I care about, which is they were by far the closest to beating the eventual Super Bowl champions in the playoffs. In fact, they did so on the road in insanely unfavorable elements. And I legitimately, if you remember, they're going on that drive to basically make or break the entire season. And the game was up for the balance. In fact, I believe if you look at the win percentage or whatever it was, the live odds favored the Rams at the end of the game and came down late and they weren't able to pull through. But old man Stafford, still, in my opinion, very obviously an undisputed top 10. In my opinion, he's probably somewhere between the 5th to 7th best quarterback in the league still. And I mean that with full seriousness. On the note of coaching, in my opinion and many others, Sean McVay is the 2nd best head coach in the league behind Andy Reid. Unless the organization directly telegraphs or shows that they're tanking or reloading or whatever you want to call it, I'm always going to trust Sean McVay to be competitive almost regardless of the roster he has. You pair him up with the Super Bowl winning quarterback, talented as Matthew Stafford, with a gameplay and a game style that he's able to maintain even with his age. And yeah, this is a competitive team. In their draft, they didn't have a pick until round 2, pick number 46 overall, and they did what most people were expecting them to do, which was take a tight end, Terrence Ferguson out of Oregon. Even though their tight end room was quote unquote full, Tyler Higbee is the highlight there. It lacked production almost entirely. Ferguson is someone who can be, at the end of this season, the clear tight end one for the Rams going forward. And although McVay's schemes don't necessarily, you don't think of them fully as incorporating the tight end as much, having consistency at the tight end position is so huge for an offense, especially when you're dealing with a genius like McVay who can just rely on having a guy potentially like Ferguson be there for him. And then another character of note, Harquez Hunter. This was actually a 4th round pick, running back out of Auburn. And the reason I highlighted is anytime that Sean McVay takes one of these types of players, you almost have to perk up a bit. Among qualified rushers last season in the SEC, he led the conference in yards after contact at over 4 yards after contact. And
Wow.
He is a feisty little guy. He is 5'9", 205 pounds with something to prove.
Why'd you have to say it like that?
I'm sorry.
He's a feisty little guy.
I'm not comparing myself to an NFL
gosh.
athlete in the slightest, but anytime I see an NFL athlete and I'm like, I'm literally 9 inches taller than you, I'm like, whoa, you are on a mission, pal. Like, this is nothing but, I mean that as a full compliment. Like, let's go, dude. These are the types of gadget players that you can look up in 3 years and go, dang, Sean McVay just knows how to pick them. I'm not saying that's a guarantee. This is a 4th round running back. He could fizzle out, might not even make the roster. I just want to plant the seed in people's minds and put it on the record that this is the type of character that you look back on near the end of their rookie contract and be like, wow, what a steal. And then you get into the free agency. There's a very obvious highlight here, as we all know. Matthew Stafford returns. This is incredible for the Rams, and it keeps their Super Bowl window open. Adam and I, we've discussed this time and time again. I've always been this way. I don't know. I think you've more so come around to the Rams propaganda that I've been skewing. This is a team that, as long as Sean McVay and Matthew Stafford are there, are competing for Super Bowls. That's the goal, and that's a legitimate window for them. They replace a 32-year-old Cooper Kupp with a significant injury history with a 33-year-old Devontae Adams who's had a shaky last 4 years of his career, but certainly not injury-ridden. I would say
surprisingly really good. People don't talk about, like, he did not play that many games last year, and I think he still broke 1,000 yards. Like, surprisingly really good.
This is worst case, and I'm removing injury from the equation. Worst case scenario, it's a lateral move. And really, there's probably a lot of upside with this move. And that's not a diss at Cooper Kupp in terms of the entirety of his career, just acknowledging where he's at right now as an NFL player. And then adding on to that, they snag Poona Ford from the Chargers to bring shockingly, even more size and talent to that defensive line, which is already going to be, we talked about this in a previous episode, how, who were we saying might have the scariest pass rush in the league? The Giants. The Rams are going to be up there too with their youth, and now tossing Poona Ford into the mix. Overall, I give this offseason a B+. This is partially because the draft was, I would say above average, but it didn't blow me away. And, in free agency, you added maybe slightly more talent. It's basically, the heavy lifting here's probably taking this all the way from a B-, which would still be a good grade relatively on the curve, to a B+, is the Matthew Stafford re-signing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't know.
Thanks.
I feel no problem, pal. I think that last year it wasn't that. I guess I don't know. Like when I think about like how I view the Rams, it really was the first season after their Super Bowl, right? Like they still had Sean McVay and Matthew Stafford.
Yeah.
I was definitely on the train like, okay, it's going to take some time for them to rebuild this. Um and then I don't know if you still thought that they were Super Bowl contenders after that, but I was like, okay, like this team, they're not going to be competing for Super Bowls for a while. I severely underestimated how quickly they could revamp that that roster because they seem to have done it really, really quickly. Like it was really shocking to me, and so it really wasn't until last year that I like took a step back and was like, oh wow, like obviously I knew that they had these players, but I didn't really consider the fact that, you know, they have kind of reached the level with their roster that if they maintain that level, they will be a Super Bowl contender as long as McVay and Stafford are there. Because I
Yeah,
always
it's just
like, it's kind of funny just because like it's not like that I came around to Matthew Stafford and Sean McVay. I always thought that they were incredible. It's more that I was not really, I guess I wasn't as impressed with the roster pieces as quickly until last season.
yeah. Well, I think it's also one of those things where just in general, people don't understand top to bottom how competent and well run the Los Angeles Rams are
They really are.
as an organization. I mean, they're cutting edge. They're very in NFL terms progressive in the way that they game plan. I mean, they basically Sean McVay, with much controversy, basically invented the concept of just not playing any of your starters in the preseason. I mean, people
True.
forget about like as an organization, they do things differently, and a lot more times than not, it works out for them.
Which has really negatively impacted the Bengals and Zach Taylor. So frick you, Sean McVay. But clearly Sean McVay does that right. And Zach Taylor was missing a few things whenever he took that strategy from him with his time with Sean McVay. Anyway, but yeah, no, I think that grade makes sense. Let's move on to the Buccaneers. The Buccaneers last year, I think that they kind of I think they definitely did better than their expectations. And I think a lot of that is just because I think Baker Mayfield is severely underrated. I feel like I've had stock in Baker Mayfield for as long as since I've seen him play. You know, when he was on the Browns.
I have property on Baker Mayfield Island.
Listen, man, I am the number one stockholder of Baker Mayfield stock. And as soon as, you know, the whole situation with Deshaun Watson and everything with the Browns happened, that's when I invested heavily while it was low, and now I'm seeing the fruits of my labor. Last year he had a breakout year.
Oh, sorry, continue.
That was a crazy laugh.
That got me for whatever reason.
That really got you. Baker Mayfield had a breakout year under who I think is going to be a great head coach, Liam Cohen. 4,500 yards, 41 touchdowns. Just really amazing. Some other guys that kind of broke out on the scene. Bucky Irving, my GOAT, saved my fantasy team. That's gonna sound terrible.
I don't care. Insert barking noises.
We got these new microphones trying to increase our quality, and you immediately ruin it. Oh my gosh!
What can I say? I'm overflowing with love for Bucky.
I love Bucky Irving, man. Just saved my fantasy season. I picked him up like week 3 or something like that. Totally worth it. And then another big highlight, shout out to Mike Evans, who in the last week of the season hit 1,000 receiving yards for the 11th straight season and clinched it on the final play of the year. Shout out Mike Evans. Definitely an underrated wide receiver. Incredibly consistent. Love it. Okay, moving on to their team needs. They need an edge rusher. 3 of their top 6 defenders in terms of total pressures hit free agency last year. They're an incredibly blitz dependent defense. And so, I think last year, and this is something that I always thought was pretty obvious, but it kind of seems like after last year's Super Bowl, people realize that if you can generate pressure without having to blitz, that's like really cool.
Shocking new innovation.
Like so obvious, but
hard to do.
Yeah, but it's very hard to do. Exactly. And then, kind of, I think like their tight end room is a little bit lacking specifically. Okay, let's move on to key signings. Big one was Hassan Reddick, right? 1 year, $14 million deal. Hopefully he's more willing to play since he like actually signed this contract. He's an incredibly,
one would think.
Yeah, you would imagine, which is just crazy because like looking back on it, so he signed a 1 year, $14 million contract. Like how much money did he lose? Do you think? Like it's crazy. But yeah, I mean, I think he's still an incredible pass rusher. I think that's exactly what they needed. That's honestly the only free agency signing that I pointed out, just because everyone else just was like kind of more depth pieces around the edges that I didn't really want to talk about. But I think it gets interesting when we get to the draft. So in round 1, this is kind of a situation where clearly they said, we're going to just pick the more talented guys as opposed to necessarily what we need. They got Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. He's incredible at creating separation. He was actually 95th percentile in college football last year when it comes to creating separation. Wow. I think his ceiling is like a dynamic wide receiver 1, but even if he comes in as wide receiver 3, like that's incredible, right? Like if you can get a guy,
I mean, you have Mike
talent,
Evans and Chris Godwin on your team,
and then I'm trying to forget what his name is. I keep forgetting for some reason. But he kind of broke out into the scene with the injuries with Godwin. And, oh my gosh. I don't know why I can't think of his name. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Are you talking about Jalen McMillan?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Jalen McMillan even showed like really, really good potential last year.
I'm so educated.
You really are. I'm just terrible with names. I don't know if you've noticed, but it really is hard for me to remember. Like I can picture his face. I'm better with faces, but not that good with names. Some other pickups in the draft: Benjamin Morrison, Notre Dame, really, really high IQ cover corner. He kind of dropped just because of injuries. So in terms of just like talent and production, like that was a steal within the draft. They also got another edge, David Walker from Central Arkansas. He's a little bit undersized, but he still has a lot of production, even in spite of that. Overall, I gave this offseason. Sorry, I got to talk about the new offensive coordinator, Josh Grizzard, which is awesome. He was promoted internally. He was previously the passing game coordinator. I think that when you have a offensive system that Liam Cohen, created, it makes sense to, hire a guy from that offensive system. So, and especially because he was the passing game coordinator. So last year, with that passing game, they were the NFL's best when it comes to third down conversion rate at 50.9%. He's incredible at creating game plans. Like that's kind of one of his strengths and what his, role was within that organization. And then specifically, he is a huge locker room guy. Like I was kind of reading some articles about just like the internal culture and kind of makeup and hierarchy within that team. And he gets a lot of player respect. And so I feel like it makes a lot of sense. I think that he's going to be able to kind of take what Liam Cohen started and continue it and even potentially improve on it as their offensive weapons increased. Overall, I gave the Buccaneers a B minus. I gave them a B minus because I don't necessarily think they're going to be that much better. Like in terms of win totals, like I think their ceiling is like 11 wins and their floor is like 9. Last year, that's exactly where they placed. So from that perspective, it's like, meh. But from the perspective of making the right internal decisions and around the edges and drafting well, and also like targeting your big team needs, I thought it was a great offseason. And actually, one thing that's interesting, which I didn't realize that's good about the offensive coordinator hire and kind of moving him up, is just the continuity. Apparently, Baker Mayfield has had 8 offensive coordinators in 8 seasons. I completely forgot that I wrote that down. That's crazy.
It is insane.
So just keeping that continuity is good. I expect Baker Mayfield to improve on the already incredible season that he have. Maybe not improve, but at least sustain the same level of excellence.
Yeah, I would have given them probably the exact same grade, B minus. It evens out between a pretty lackluster free agency, but then a quality draft. Really it's not even a topic for discussion. It's really more of a rhetorical question for you, audience member. Is Todd Bowles good at his job? The answer might shock you. It's no. It was a really rhetorical question. I kind of answered it for you. But
why do you say that?
I don't think Todd Bowles is a good head coach.
Yeah, he might not be.
But it also, for the Buccaneers, might not matter. They're a very weird organization in that sense.
They really are. They really are.
Just that whole division, the NFC South, what a fun time.
Yeah, I really was like, it was just kind of boring, to be honest, to grade them. Just because it was like, and so what? Like, what does this mean in the grand scheme of things? Like, yeah,
I don't know about you. I enjoy myself some NFC. Well, no, I enjoy watching the Panthers and the Bucks. I enjoy watching the top of the division, the bottom. The Saints and the Falcons disgust me.
It's just not fun football to watch. It just really isn't.
Not.
I'm right there with you because I love watching Baker Mayfield, and then last year in the stretch, watching Bryce Young was really fun to watch. But dude, the Saints, like watching Derek Carr try and throw the football.
Throw the football is crazy.
It's just like, well, that's not what's supposed to happen.
So we wrapped up the entirety of our NFL offseason grades. We did it. We made it all the way through. So we will end this episode. And as I want to start a little tradition because we did it last week with Jameis Winston. The one player that I'm going to shout out that you need to go watch highlights of is, as I already mentioned, Fred Warner. Go watch Fred Warner highlights.
Love it.
Once again, leave this video. Do not engage. Do not comment. Do not subscribe. Go watch all of the Fred Warner highlights that you possibly can and just have a good time. And just pour yourself a big bottle of wine, grab a cigar, and just become a Fred Warner aficionado.
Listen, Fred Warner is fun. He kind of reminds me of Christian McCaffrey, Luke Kuechly. Back in the day. I loved watching him growing up.
Yes.
But yeah,
it's like
right,
if
guys.
Luke Kuechly was black. We'll see you, folks.
Yeah, and with that, we'll see you later.